And I'll ask Janine to lead us in a karakia, please.
Mōrena koutou. Whakatakataho ki te uru, whakatakataho ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tā. Hei hiaki ana te atakura, hei tio, hei whika, hei auhu, hei mauri ora.
Thank you. Excuse me. Have we got any apologies?
Oh, Warren, I think, online.
Warren's online.
Yeah.
So I think we're okay. So we'll move on. Confirmation of the agenda. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Are there any other interests that committee members wish to disclose at this time? I'll take that as a no. So we move on then to the confirmation of minutes of the meeting on the 15th of March. Have any members got any amendments that they wish to table at this stage? If not, could I have a mover and seconder that those minutes are a true and correct record? Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Chris. All those in favour say aye. To the contrary, carried. Thank you. What I thought we would do before starting in the agenda proper is I had a very interesting conversation with the acting CEO prior to this meeting, and I thought it would be quite interesting for the committee to have the opportunity of hearing that as well, because I think it's very pertinent. So Tracy, floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and morning councillors and committee members. Prior to Chris going away on holiday, and he will be back in 7 days, I am counting, he did say to me that the chair was likely to ask me for some of the insights, just some of the matters that are what are keeping me awake at night matters. So I've got a couple of those. I've also just got a couple of reflections at the end of the month, the end of this week. I would have been the acting chief executive, almost a month. So I think there's a couple of insights that I'd like to share with you from last night. I was reflecting, if I was a member of an audit and risk committee, I'd want to know if my chief executive had been away for a month, if anything bubbled up to the top, if it didn't, why or why not. So there's just a couple of those insights. So just to start, I guess things that may or may not be keeping me awake is around our operating environment. ELT, the executive, spent 2 days in this good room end of last week trying to nut our way through the start of our long-term plan. So when we get information back from strategic pay that say here are your here's what the market's indicating for staff salaries, and it's a larger number than we've had to grapple with in the over a decade that I've worked here. And grappling with numbers such as that, and having a respectful approach to that information, but a measured approach as well. So that's one thing kind of in this operating environment pot. The other is a matter around asset revaluations going into the LTP, and that will be discussed, I'm sure, at length further into the process. As we always do, we went out to the organisation and asked our fabulous staff what they think they need through the LTP, what the calls on the LTP are, and they weren't insignificant. But taking that on board, it was then the executive's, I guess, job to say, okay, what can we deliver within our fiscal and operating envelope? And councillors, all our councillors will see the start of that conversation on Monday. But it's not going to be an easy conversation. They never are. LTPs, long-term plans, are never easy conversations. But for me, and you'll hear from Janine about this on Monday, but from me, our LTP is signalling what are we going to need to do to keep the lights on, to take care of our staff, to do our business that we need to do to keep the lights on, to do our bread and butter business and to deliver well. It might not look as fancy, as robust, as headline grabbing as it has in other years, but that might be a good thing as well. So that for me is something that we're acutely aware of, that for those councillors who are able to make, and I think both our independent committee members were able to make the presentation from Brad Olsen last week. Sobering and exciting all at the same time, but it was really useful to just provide that umbrella and that wraparound for us. Couple of other matters, I guess the Future for Local Government report was out yesterday. There were some great headlines this morning. National program, My Gospel for News, is reporting its most significant thinking around local government since 1989. I'll use a term that Councillor Mahuta has used. It's great we've got the report, but now it's hurry up and wait. We've got a report with recommendations. Very unlikely anything's going to be done with that in the 21 sitting days that the government has left before they break for the election, and then post the election, what kind of traction's going to happen. For me, we as an organisation read the tea leaves well. There's no big surprises in there, I have to say, but that tandemed up with next week, we should have the select committee report back to the House on RM reform. That is not going to be a hurry up and wait. That is going to be a things will happen now. I mentioned the government's got 21 sitting days until they break on the 8th of September. They've got quite the reform bow wave that they implemented. So it will be interesting to see what actually just gets past muster and what implications that will have for the way we do business. The last thing, I guess, from a acutely aware of situation is around our catchments. I see the heavens are about to deliver again. They are fully saturated. It is a matter that has been picked up in the agenda for you, and I think the risk report that Scott has prepared, it's not something that as an organisation we're very anxious about, but we're making sure we're prepared. The chair asked me, so where is the biggest risk that I see? Where is my biggest concern? And it's around the people side of it. I'm less worried about the actual infrastructure and its ability, but it's that making sure we've got the depth in people. Our first line of people, they need to sleep and eat and spend some time with their family. While they're having down, where's our second line, where's our third line? So it's just making sure that we have that robustness in place. And again, that's a matter that's addressed in the report. Lastly, just a couple of reflections on being the Chief Executive for the period I have been. I guess the first thing is there's nothing unusual and untoward that hasn't been created by nature or power failures that I wasn't aware of. So in terms of the briefing and the handover that Chris gave me, there has been no surprises. How the tension in the system where, say, the 42 things he briefed me on, which comes to the top or which hasn't, has been really much determined on either customers or ratepayers, but there's been no surprises. I really wanted to note that there is an early heads up culture amongst our executive leadership team. If there is an issue, even if it's just a, hey, I'm not sure how significant this is an issue, but I just want to let you know. I'm not asking for you to solve it for me. I just want to let you know that there's something, we'll work on it. Please be aware of that. So I've really valued that. Secondly, I've really noticed if I've needed to understand an issue or respond to somebody, the managers, the team leaders all know. So there is not a holding of information by a single director about a single topic. There is a depth of knowledge about an issue. And for me, that's the strength of an organisation, and it shows a bit of a robustness. That's not to say there haven't been some complex and challenging issues, but been really well supported by the executive. There is nothing that has popped up that Chris wasn't across that I don't know. And there hasn't been anything where I haven't found anyone in the organisation who doesn't know about it. So I just think it's important as a risk and assurance committee, the chief executive's away for almost 5 weeks. That's when you find out if some things aren't as well oiled as they should be. I've definitely appreciated the additional administrivia that a chief executive must perform. But yeah, I just wanted to give you that assurance that, look, I think you've got an organisation that has a bit of depth to it. Your chief executive as well, supported by the executive management team and their management teams. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I see we've got our guests from Audit New Zealand, David and Clarence, and their teams. Would you like to introduce yourselves just briefly to the committee?
Red says stop. Here it means go. First of all, Graham, Chair, thank you very much, and apologies for being late. There we go.
No problem.
So to everyone, as I've told you all before, I've been here for 6 years and 22 is my last year, so I roll off the audit. Clarence, who's out of the Tauranga office, takes over from me. He's familiar with the regional council. He's been here before me. That's Clarence. Jay is an audit manager. I'm not quite sure where Jay lives, actually, whether it's Auckland, Tauranga, or Hamilton. Yesterday she was with me, I think in Auckland, and this morning she walked in Hamilton. So Jay, like me, seems to be all over the place. And Kay, who was in the audit for 22, is a Hamilton man, and Jay will be taking over from Kay for the 23 year.
Thank you. What I was proposing to do, given that you people are obviously under the pump, given the late delivery of our 22 audit, I thought we might rearrange the agenda and move straight away to item 9 to give the committee an update just on where the 21-22 annual report is and the audit.
Super, I can pick that off. I presume that's on page 101. Just make sure that we're all in the same place.
Yep.
So you've got audit clearance for the 22J year. We've managed to work through the key thing that challenged both yourselves and us, which is the fair value assessments. And so you've got audit clearance. I've provided Janine with a draft of the letter of representation and the draft of the audit opinion. I've also provided Janine with the summary letter of representation and the summary audit opinion. So effectively, I guess that's the key thing, trying to field the questions that I know you're going to ask. First of all, yes, we do in both audit opinions refer to the lateness and acknowledge the fact that it is due to audit shortages and COVID. And we've just left it at that. Casting one's mind back, I know that originally you were planned to be audited towards the sort of end of the third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter in 2022. And when we came with proposed dates at that time, it was a case of, oh no, horror, we've got our project reboot implementation at the time. And so we then effectively mutually agreed that I thought, that it would be better to put the orders into the 23 year. So it was more of a timing issue. I think the way the resourcing was in 22 limited the flexibility that we had. So dare say, it was almost a case of we had to move to 23, but it was by, shall I say, mutual, sort of mutual benefit. Audit was looking to move out because we didn't have the appropriate staffing at the time, and of course you had Project Reboot, so we moved it out. I think those were the key items that probably everyone would be most interested in. The fair value assessment was probably the most challenging element of the audit, and there's probably, I'm anticipating, there's probably a number of questions that members would like to either ask. Before, Chair, chucking it back to you, I suppose a stand back from it was that with some of your staff and dare say key staff being seconded to Project Reboot for the implementation, and if I was the regional council, I would have done the same. So this is not a case of, I mean, I absolutely agree. Project Reboot's looking forward. It's critical. You want your best staff there, and that's what you did. Unfortunately, the people that backfilled some of those roles didn't really have the council experience and the local government knowledge, the public sector knowledge and experience. And so we did go through quite a trying period of landing on what the fair value was, and there were a number of errors. I say errors. Error kind of like, there's a mistake, but somebody's made a mistake. But sometimes it's not somebody made a mistake. It's circumstances at the time. Some of those things were, for example, as simple as there was a formula calculation error in one of the worksheets. The opening balances at the beginning of the financial year, in other words, 1st of July 2021, the opening balances didn't agree to the fixed assets register. When the reconciliation and the fair value assessment was being done, capitalizations that took place during 2022 hadn't been included. So with all those sorts of things, and there's more, I mean, I can sure go more, but I don't want to bore you with the detail. With all those sort of errors meant that the gap between what we were assessing and what council was coming up with was still quite big. And we're saying, well, then you need to do something. We need to either recognize a value or you need to do a full valuation. But we couldn't live with that gap because it was material. And if there was a material gap, it became an opinion issue. So we kept, we kept going back, but this can't be right. But this can't be right. And so with the toing and froing, we eventually ironed out, sort of all the errors that we found, and we eventually landed on the right place. The consequence was that there was a big gap in fair value, and council, as you've seen from the financial statements, council recognised fair value on key assets. I don't want to sound I don't want to give the wrong message, but obviously if you're fixing something, you fix it to the best of your ability without causing yourself a whole lot of problems or angst or extra time and effort. And knowing that you had a valuation coming up in the 23 year, it was a case of let's fix it to the best of our joint abilities now for 22. And, you know, and then it's at least it's right. And you can say your property, plant and equipment does represent fair value. And then you can move on into the 23 year. So we felt that was pragmatic, sensible, save both parties, you know, save both parties that soft cost. So I've talked a lot around that. I've got one other matter which is addressed in those pages in a couple of places. And on paragraph 18, here we talk about the rationale for the reduced materiality threshold has not been provided to staff. In the beginning, that paragraph is quite closely related to I think it's paragraph, it's an earlier paragraph. I think it's about 11. Yes, paragraph 11. What the issue was there was I provided Janine with an audit plan for the 22 year, but we didn't have all the information we needed at the time. So what I provided was a draft audit plan, obviously, you know, for discussion, and there was still information to be updated in that. What changed between the 21 year and the 22 year is a very small and subtle change, but made quite a big difference. And I thought I had explained this to Council Janine, and maybe not Evan. I don't recall, but I feel as though I had actually answered the question. And unfortunately, I mean, I could quite easily have answered that question if somebody had just phoned me at the time of preparing these papers. But I know Council had asked that information, and I thought I did explained it, but obviously not. What it was, the calculation of materiality changed from using total assets to using total PP&E assets, property, plant and equipment. The reason for the change was that through central analysis, there became some skewed results. And the regional council was one of those where you could have a skewed result. The key reason for that is you have such a large investment fund. Your managed fund is huge. I mean, what's it? It's like, off the top of my head is, you know, it's 100 million. So it's a massive figure. And so if you're including that in your calculation of the asset materiality, you can have an error in your PP&E, in your fixed assets, which is actually much bigger than you really want it to be. And so that caused the change. That's why the fixed asset materiality in 22 was actually lower than the fixed asset materiality in 21. And because we didn't have that information and those worksheets weren't available at that time, the 2021 materiality figures had been rolled forward and was in the draft audit plan, which I provided to Janine. And I actually went back and I found the email, Janine. It was my fault. I sent it to you. But that's what it was. It was the draft, and we didn't have all the information. And I think in my email, I did refer to we didn't have all the information in the draft. I hope I haven't gone too technical, and I obviously welcome questions. And I suppose I can only apologize. I looked in my emails to see whether I had answered that question by email, and I didn't. I hadn't. So I can only apologize for that. But when I saw it, I knew what the answer was. I didn't have to go digging for it. I just went to the printout pages and I sort of printed out the relevant pages should anyone want to see and have a look in more detail. Chair, I think that's the key things about the 22 audit. Clearance you've got. And I'm here to answer sort of any questions. I'd like to be at the adoption meeting, because I think it's only fair that councillors, the broader councillors have an opportunity to say, why are you so late? I think the last thing I'd like to share, which does lead a little bit into 23 and Clarence, is that the OAG, in fact, John Ryan himself, has been around the offices, and he's basically, in a nice way, he said, get your act together, and you better well be within the statutory timeframes for 23. So that's putting it in the politest possible way I can. So dare say, in the industry for both any of the 22 audits, as well, including the December 22 audits, it's a case of being completely task focused on getting the job done. Wherever time could be saved, like travel costs, I haven't been here as much as I would like to have, and as much as I have in all previous years. I've got some clients further afield. I haven't even met the people yet, because there's flight time, travel time. I've met them, of course, in Zoom. So, and 23 is going to be different. So the OAG really John Ryan has shaken a finger at us as Audit New Zealand and said, get it up to date. Clarence and I've known Clarence for a long time. He's been here before. We've already done a handover. We'll continue to do a handover. I'm often in Hamilton, so is he. So there really won't and shouldn't be any difficulty from a handover perspective. And we'll be liaising closely. I said to Clarence this morning, one of the things I did want to offer, but it somewhat falls into Clarence's court, that we, Audit and the Regional Council, sit down and just do a bit of a debrief and drill down into, some of the things that didn't go right, could be done better, what could Audit do better, what can Council do better, and just with a whole focus of trying to make sure that that your audit goes quicker, easier, smoother for 2023. Noting the threat we are under, but also, in all the past years I've been involved with this council, you've been really good deliverers. Get the annual report out, and on a very much on a personal note, I suppose, more to Graham and to Janine. You've been probably one of my favorite councils, because you do get things done, you do deliver. 22 was a complete exception, and all I can say to Clarence is he's very lucky. I used to like to use a few other words like bloody lucky, but so Chair, I think I've done my dash.
Thank you, David. Before I open up to questions, Janine, is there anything you would like to say, particularly for the process that our councils go through? Because we have got a few differences this year. Normally the annual report would come to this committee, and this committee would provide some assurance to the Finance Committee in their consideration of the annual report. But as part of this hardly usual year, we're going to have to do things slightly differently. Janine.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think, as David has indicated, we do have clearance on the annual report document. So thank you to the team for doing that. And we have received an unmodified draft audit opinion to that effect, which is a fantastic outcome. As Graham said, normally what we would do is that the Risk and Assurance Committee provide a note of assurance to the Finance and Services Committee that they are not aware of any issues that should preclude the council from adopting. Unfortunately, with the timing that we are under, we haven't been able to orchestrate what would have to have been an extraordinary meeting of the Finance and Services Committee to receive that. But I think there is an opportunity when full council consider the report next week as part of the June council meeting for members of the committee to be able to voice that support from this committee to council in their adoption process. And so I guess that was part of the intent of being really transparent here around what did change from the last time the committee had the opportunity to consider those key accounting estimates and judgments, but noting that there is, other than the work around the revaluations, there have been no other substantial changes in terms of those underlying principles. So I think that's probably a way through that at least this committee has had the opportunity to consider that, and there is the ability from committee members to voice that support or no known reasons why council wouldn't be in the position to adopt its annual report.
Thank you, Janine. Questions? I'm sure there are several.
Maybe if I could just lead off. Thanks, Mr. Chair. David, I'm not familiar with the PBE on materiality. I am intrigued as to why investment asset is included from total assets in terms of determining materiality levels for assets, because my understanding of an investment is it is an asset, clearly. So if there is something in the PBE which excludes it, then I'd like to know that. My second question relates to what audit work, if anything, has been done on the costs building up the schedule which determines the figure on which the revaluation has been based for stop banks in particular. Figures understandably are below your materiality level, so I would understand if you haven't done any work on it. If you haven't, then I would like to know what you've done to give yourself comfort on the figure that's been arrived at. So, yeah.
Through you, Chair. Thanks very much, Chris. Your first question around PPE, so our materiality effectively is split into two materialities. One we refer to asset intensive, and the other we refer to as, there's lots of names for it, but we call it lower materiality simply because it's a lower figure. And that was brought about in the public sector largely because of the nature of entities. So look at councils, you have roads, water facility, all these things, they're massive assets, massive values. So to use a materiality that I would use when selecting a sample out of the, your expenses or revenue, I'd spend my life testing assets. So for that reason, in the whole time you've got to stand back and say, if there's an error, what would change the reader's mind? And so we split our materiality. Now, this conversation, and to answer your question, I'm focusing on the asset intensive materiality. And while this idea has evolved over time, over a few years, the initial materiality was calculated on total assets. And one of the key focuses of that is around revaluations. So that's, the roads are revalued, stop banks are revalued, or it's around the revaluations of property, plant and equipment. And what was happening, what Central found out or stumbled across was that if total assets are used, then you're starting to include a whole lot of assets which are not subject to the risky process of valuations. And valuations are big numbers, have management judgments, have external people involved, experts involved. So there's a higher risk in that PP&E valuation space. So under the total asset, I could be including your debtors, your cash and bank, the investment fund. So all of those would be coming into the determination of what is material, when in fact materiality is looking at the property, plant and equipment, your fixed assets. And because of the anomalies that came out of it, that's why the methodology across the whole of Audit New Zealand, not just this council, was changed from 21, and in 22, the materiality was based on PP&E, and that was the reason. Yes, your debtors are still an asset, and they looked at, yes, your fund management asset is an asset, and that's at fair value, and that gets looked at, under separate audit. Does that answer your first question?
Sort of. My question was, is there a standard which says that's how it should be done? Or is this just an audit office dictate?
The actual standards talk about materiality and significant risks, and so the standards put it in place for the auditors to determine what is material for those financial statements. So the standards don't go and say you have to have two materialities. They don't go into that level of detail. From an audit, from a public sector, from an OAG's perspective, the materiality is quite messy, quite complex. So, for example, something like sensitive expenditure, there's almost no level of materiality because it has the media impact. So the standards do introduce the subject of significance, material. They use all those words, but then when you start to get down into the implementation of it, you then start to say, will it provide a fair result? What is representative? And so, so it is driven from the standards, but obviously they're at a high level.
Chris?
So that was the first question. I'm sorry, Graham.
I think, can we just stop there for a minute? I've got an issue with that because the opinion that you provide hasn't changed at all. And I think that's the issue that Chris is raising. You've always had, as long as I can remember, a two-tier materiality in the local government sector because of the very capital-intensive nature of most of the council balance sheets. So really, it seems to me this is something that's really been changed by Audit New Zealand, not by the auditing profession. And I really don't find your answer convincing.
So the change from total assets to just using PP&E as the basis of calculating the asset intensive materiality, yes, that was an Audit New Zealand methodology change. The reasons I've already said, I've explained.
But your opinion didn't change. With your performance measures opinions, you now express virtually individual opinions on the material performance measures. But the opinion you express on the financial statements is still as to their overall fairness.
Well, I think it continues to do that. That's the actual opinion is based on methodology and standards change. I mean, for example, this year we've got 48 that comes in. The auditing standard 315 changes. Yeah, so these things are changing all the time, but the opinion doesn't change for them.
Yeah, I know that. But if you're looking at the overall fairness of those financial statements, I don't accept the validity of carving out a $100 million investment fund to have a lower materiality on PP&E.
The investment fund's not carved out. It is covered under the
Well, it
lower
must be.
materiality that's covered by
Because
the,
they're not
by the
audited.
rest of the, all the other audit balances.
Sorry, it must be, because you've actually said you set a materiality on PPE only.
Or PPE.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
So, council used, there is no standard to tell you what material, what's material. It's a set of principles. And basically the principle is that it's material if it would change your view of the entity. That's as vague as it is. So Audit New Zealand does all this fancy calculations and they say 10% of this and 7% of that, which is just a rule of thumb. That's not reliable either. It's a rule of thumb because they've got to have something. So they require that to set testing levels. But if you went to court and argue whether a difference is material, their rule of thumb would only be indicative. The answer comes back. The FMA's got comments that says the statement's actually relevant, faithful, comparable, timely, understandable, but it doesn't say what material it. So it's a very tricky and it's completely judgmental. To get to your point, I'm going to be the odd one out here. I'm going to agree with Audit New Zealand. So if we have two councils with exactly the same PP&E balance, we have an error that's 12%. So this one here, 12%, it's material, say. This one here happens to have 100 million of other assets. That's not material. But the view of the PP&E part of the balance sheet hasn't changed. So, and all it can't affect the opinion in the end because the opinion has to be a stand back and well, what's the error? But it does affect the testing level. So I've got some sympathy for your approach, to be honest, because you're getting comparable outcomes. You've still got to stand back, look at the whole asset base when you form your opinion, and say, well, is this error? Okay, it's 10% of that group, but is that still going to stand back? But for the purposes of doing the audit, which is where we get the subjective thumbs that you put together, and everyone does it, so it's standard practice. The auditor's standards require you to do it. I have some sympathy. I'll shut up.
Chair, I should just, I mean, what Paul says is absolutely accurate. To determine some of those percentages, if anyone's keen on statistics, the probability of determining error and the size of that error really comes down, it's boiled down, over taking multiple audits. As we generally audit to, there being 95% assurance that if you're following proper process, you've got a 95% confidence level that there will not be a material error. And to get to that point, one of the factors in that is the 3%, the 10%, the percentage of the 12% that Paul was talking about. And those percentages, if you take those percentages, they give you sufficient sample size such that your sample size fairly represents the population. And so the percentages are determined statistically with large samples and over time.
Janine, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess just to share with the committee the way that I have viewed this issue is from a couple of lenses. At the end of the day, with where we landed with the assessment of revaluation movement, whatever that material threshold was, we were in excess of it. So technically, in order to get as smoother path through audit as possible, there was an action that we needed to take. My concern really arises from a little bit of misdirection at the beginning of the process when staff were preparing for the annual report and undertaking those revaluation, the accounting estimates and judgments, where we had a level of materiality in mind, and the work that had been done at that point in time, which was subsequently found to have issues with it, was within that materiality threshold. Now, when that materiality threshold changed and that wasn't well communicated in terms of the rationale for it, then that just added extra pressure into the system. But I have to come back to the point that whatever that number was, the impact of the adjusted, worked through, confirmed revaluation movement was in excess of that. So there was an action technically that we would have been required to take. But there are lots of lessons in here, I think, for both WRC and for Audit New Zealand around process, communication, clarity of what we're collectively driving towards.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for that. I feel like I learned a lot after reading that. It's really helped as well. My question was more for Janine around since there was a part on the regional council side of data not quite. Are you confident that the process, you know how to make that easier in future, so that these oversights of, say, the Excel spreadsheets will make things be less of an issue in the next year, since we do want it to go quickly?
Yeah, so well, I'm not sure that it will go quickly in the next year because we've actually got a full revaluation that will be landing. I think, in fairness, this is an organisational process, so this is not necessary. So finance end up fronting a lot of these conversations, but it is working hand in glove with our asset management as well. So, like I say, there are definitely learnings in this. The process has been slightly unusual this time in terms of normally we would actually just get an external assessment done on that movement and assets, and there has been additional work done by staff this time with a peer review base. So look, we live and we learn, and I think when you go through a protracted process as we have this time, the objective is always never to find ourselves in that position again.
Yeah, it was more around whether you feel like you've got bring it up.
Yeah, and look, I think it is, some of it is a symptom of some parts of the organisation absolutely being under pressure, and that's a conversation that we will bringing back through LTP and the like.
Chair, can I just say, I sympathise and agree with Janine. You know, starting off with that wrong materiality balance, made it a little difficult because there's the mark, and then you're operating within that. The in-between steps, I can't remember exactly when the numbers were communicated and whatever, but the starting point clearly that I gave Janine was wrong, because it was a roll forward from the previous year and it was a draft. I think what chucked this year into a spin was when the original plans and the original audit didn't go ahead, because all of a sudden we're now putting this on hold, and so the process stops, and then it restarted up again in February this year. So I just for everybody's sort of, shall I say, appreciation for the role that Janine's had, it does, it hasn't made her life any easier, but it was almost that case of a perfect storm. It was the difficult starting point, then the deferral, etc., and then the errors in the process of trying to get to the final number. Sorry, Chair.
I think we've thrashed out materiality quite fulsomely. Chris, what was the subsequent parts of your question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second part relates specifically to the accumulation of costs in relation to the assets on which the revaluation has been applied. And individually, the materiality levels were below your threshold, but there's a significant number in there, and it has ongoing implications in terms of our long-term plan and costs for ratepayers. I'm really struggling to understand how we've arrived at such a number for the revaluation of stock banks in particular. It doesn't align with any information that I've got, but it's in accordance with our records, I assume, because you people have actually audited them. And I'd like confirmation that the costs that have been accumulated in there are in accordance with the relevant accounting standard, which I believe is number 16. Public 16. So there's We're going to have a subsequent discussion about that, but I am yet to be convinced that that is a fair number.
Through your chair, so the one in your initial question, you made specific reference to stop banks. Quite understand that, it's the biggest asset. There's stop banks and other stop bank assets, you know, sort of pumps and other things. But if you just focus on the stop banks, because it's a big number. So we will audit additions, transactions for the current year. They will get capitalized into the asset, stop banks or any other asset, floodgates. It'll get capitalized into assets. Down the road, those assets will get revalued, and those revalued amounts effectively replace those costs. And so what's reflected in the financial statements are the costs plus the valuations that have been added onto them. So we don't go back to the costs that have been incurred in past years. The costs that we will look at are those costs that have been incurred in the current year. And yes, we do look at them, we sample them, and we follow through the process. In our management report, or the report to governors, which you don't have yet, which normally goes to Janine first, there are a couple of examples in there. For example, capitalization of assets should take place on a more frequent basis. For example, the fixed assets register should be reconciled to the general ledger. These are recommendations that we've got, and that reconciliation will then, follow that through. The fixed assets register individualizes your various assets, and then it's back to where I started earlier about your costs. Yes, we do look at the costs to get capitalized in that financial year, and if they haven't been capitalized, it's the costs that go into your capital work.
Go for it.
Good. So when you audit the revaluation of the assets for 2023, the assets will be revalued based on either tables showing escalations in the cost to replace the assets, because it's an optimized depreciated replacement cost, or there could be real costs quoted to do that. So what audit work do you do on the costs which are used to justify the revaluation? And specifically, we're looking at the 2023 because that's coming up, and it's something we've seen some drafts and are sort of being interested in.
Partly.
So there are two methods in play. I mean, absolutely agree with Paul, but if I can just stand back, there's there are a couple of different, let's call it 3 different methods. Your first step is it a fair value, market value? Can I step out the door and sell it? So, commonly land falls into that category. Commonly, I mean, you can't sell your land on the stop banks, but as a starting point, it is a marketable asset and can be sold. So there you talk about the market value and you look at comparable sales. So if that chunk of land across the road, you'd go and say, you're not going to sell it, but where are there other reserves that have been sold? And so we will look at comparable sales. Then when you get to the non-market valued assets, stop banks, you're not going to sell a stop bank, or I've never seen a stop bank being sold aboard. There you've got effectively two valuations. One is in between full valuations, and there you'll use indices, and then there's the full valuation. So your last full valuation was on the 31st of December 2019. So that was the basis that we went back to, because that's when there was a full valuation. And we then used indices to carry that forward to June 22. And as you know, indices, there are a whole lot of them. The the main trick there is to make sure that you're applying the right indices to the appropriate assets. So, but at a high level, indices get used. That's not what you'll be doing for the 23 year, but that's what we did do for the 22 year. Was indices, and your disclosure basically says that. For the 23 year, you're going to get engineers, consultants. You'll get external advice in terms of what are the current rates. So they would look at detail around being able to move assets, build stock banks, and all the little detail that goes into what is required to build that stock bank, and they current rates. And from that detail, I mean, I know in another audit I used where there was a complicated asset, I actually got a quantity surveyor's bill of quantities, and we priced out the bill of quantities using current rates to get an average rate for that asset type. So there's, once you get into the detail, there's lots of little fingers. You said, what is the asset, how are you going to do it? But effectively, you're wanting to say, for that stock bank, and I'll go back to the stock bank, is what's the bill of quantities to build that stock bank? It's a lot easier if you've got a pump, because you can, phone up a pump supplier. It's not quite as easy as that, but you can phone up a pump supplier. How much does it cost? What's the current rate and the pump? So that then becomes your basic costed asset. But that asset is also aged. And so the depreciated replacement cost is in fact taking that asset at current rates, but then depreciating that asset for where it is in terms of its useful life cycle.
Mr. Chair, my question relates specifically to the accounting policies that have been applied by the council and the accumulation of those costs. I understand how the rest of it works. I've been looking at, it's been a fair bit of time on this over the last few days. The actual costs of those stock banks are significantly lower than the actual figure that's been arrived at as a revaluation figure. I'm wanting to know what's included in that figure. That's driven by the accounting policies of the WRC, and I want to know what work's been done, audit work's been done, confirming that the correct accounting policy has been applied to the accumulation of that figure.
For fear of repeating myself, yes, you've got an accounting policy. It's held at a depreciated replacement cost.
I'm talking specifically about costs. The standard has costs that are excluded when you're arriving at the valuation of property, plant and equipment. I want to make sure that none of those costs have been included. The costs that the standard says should be excluded.
There are not many costs. I mean, there are some when you're capitalizing, for example, intangible assets. And if, I mean, I'd have to go into an awful lot of detail, but, and see exactly what is it that you're pointing out. But the costs that we look at, costs are expenditures incurred in the current year. The cost is not the original costs of several years ago.
Look, I understand.
I'm sorry, Chris, but I'm obviously now struggling to understand your question.
Well, I'm not explaining myself very clearly, so I think it's probably best we leave this because we're going to have a discussion about it later.
Yes, Chris, I think the fact that the council has an unmodified audit opinion is enough to say that the financial statements as presented have been prepared in accordance with the stated accounting policies, and they believe that overall they are a fair representation of the assets and the transactions for the period. So, but I think we can take that offline.
Chair, can I offer, Chris, I'm terribly sorry I didn't get to the heart of your question. Please, you're absolutely welcome to get my number from Janine. I will, come back to council to sit down. I think it's, I congratulate you on asking and driving your question, because I think it's absolutely fundamental councillors understand and be happy with So I will with pleasure. If I have to drive through from Auckland to simply come and do this, I will do it with pleasure. And, and if I can't do it, if you don't want me to do it, then I'm going to chuck the rugby ball, chuck the ball at Clarence, but I will do it with pleasure. But I'm sorry, I'm just not sure that I'm landing on your question.
Dave, thanks very much for your kind offer. And if we have to go there, we will, but
Yeah, sorry.
Do any other committee members have any other questions of David? Paul?
Yeah, very quickly. So the 23 audit got a date?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that question. Yes, we have a date. We have issued the audit plan in principle to Janine. I think we first want to just get this audit out of the way so that we can start with the 23. And I'm sure we will have these discussions again. Yes, we have dates in place, and the plan is to have it signed off before the 31st of October.
Brilliant. And completing the audit, just in manufacturing, we use lean, and you can use lean in any process. I wonder if we just efficiencies of the audit and the way that you work with the team, I think, is a big priority, because I know fees are going to become a challenge. It's been a challenge, but they're getting more challenging. So looking at, you have to decide how much you audit, but the way you go about it is something that's always open to improvement in terms of process, in terms of coordination. And I really think that needs to be a focus for the team, because we will be looking at you saying, hey, you guys got to be efficient or stop charging us, turn the clock off. So, so I'm not accusing you of anything, I'm just saying, but hey, that whole lean processing approach to trying to keep things smooth. Just careful that I'm showing what we have audit dashboard, I think would be
Sorry, thanks, Karen. Audit dashboard is where any client uploads their information. We obviously can we draw it down from that. And one of the reports in audit dashboard is you can see, when you've uploaded it, when the auditors have in fact taken it. In fact, you can see the version. So if you've sent me something and it or the client sends me something and it's wrong or not needed, it's sent back, you can see it's been requested 2 or 3 times. So there's quite a lot of information you get, and I would encourage the team to liaise, with whoever their contact people are on a regular basis, so that the whatever the outstanding is clear, transparent up front at the time. But audit dashboard is a good help.
Any other questions? David, I've got one. Given that we have not got your concluding memorandum for the audit yet, and I doubt whether that will be ready when the council has to adopt financial statements later on this month, is there anything that this committee needs to be aware of before the financial statements are presented to the full council for their consideration?
Chair Graham, I don't think so. Nothing that, I don't think there's anything that would worry at a council level. There are obviously recommendations. I have been it. I've got it. When I was talking earlier, I didn't go through it because I think it's only fair that Janine has a look at it and says, David, you're wrong here and what have you. So this is the management report, the old terminology of it, or the report now, report to governors. And a number of the items in there are around things like what I've talked about earlier, reconciliation of the fixed assets to the fixed assets register. So, yeah, I mean, I can go through I can give you the headlines now if you want, but the high level question is no, I don't think there's anything of concern to council, councils. I promised Janine, I said to Janine, I'll try and get this to her yesterday. I missed it. I sent Janine an email at about 9:30 last night saying, to be honest, I knew I was getting up early and coming through here this morning. So by 9:30, I had to say, I wasn't going to make it. I was through in the office here before everybody here, continue to review, and I'm just about finished. So I'd like to think, Janine, you'll have the management report by the end of today. The question is whether Janine and her team can provide us with management comments, and we can finalize this. And if it's finalized, then yes, you will have the finalized management report before council meeting.
Angela.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, my question's just around process in the past. You mentioned that this item would normally go to the Finance Committee before it went to full council. Did I hear that correctly? Just got a suggestion
Yeah,
around that.
through the chair. So normally we put, and we did put draft financials through Finance and Services in August last year. Normally we would then put confirmed financial results, financial and non-financial results back through that committee with and a chance to look at the actual document with the recommendation to council to adopt.
Right, and just the makeup of both committees last triennium, it's slightly different to the makeup this triennium.
They never overlap completely. They are set quite separately. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if there is time constraints, then perhaps inviting members of that committee to attend this one could have perhaps got some efficiencies, but open to your advice.
So through you, Mr. Chair, I think it comes probably down to the terms of reference of this committee, which isn't around. So the role of the Finance and Services Committee is the monitoring of that financial and non-financial performance, which is effectively the results that get reported. There's sort of a bit of a separation between Risk and Assurance Committee, terms of reference, and the Finance and Services Committee. So I think the process previously seems to have served us really well with those approval pathways. It's just unfortunate that this time it's been a bit hard to pick when we would be in a position to be able to actually put a document back through an extraordinary committee meeting. Certainly hasn't fitted with the regular committee timeframes.
Right, if there are no further questions, the only thing left, normally we would have some time, committee only time with the auditors. But given that David's said there's nothing we need to be aware of, I'm going to dispense with that. In the interest of time, we've spent considerably more time on this agenda item than was scheduled or envisaged. Is everyone comfortable with that approach? Thank you. So we have a resolution to receive this report. Do I have a mover and seconder? Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for your service over the last 6 years to the council. Much appreciated. And maybe we can just get you to do a bit of an introduction, Clarence, in that you're still in the early stages, but welcome back, I should say. And we look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, and thanks for being here and being invited, and just to introduce myself as well. I met Graham, I think it's about 14 years ago when we just started at the regional council. I just started with Audit New Zealand as well at that stage. So I've been with Audit New Zealand for the last 15 years. I've done my 6 years on the regional council, and then I was rotated off after 6 years. Now I'm back. I'm really looking forward to work with the regional council again, with Janine and the team. And I know that a lot changed, but a lot stays the same. I remember meeting Janine the first time under Mike Garrett, for those of you who can remember him. I think there's still some of the old things on the balance sheet where we have a standing disagreement. I think it's the investment in RHL, if I can remember correctly. But we'll revisit that in future, I'm sure. And I'm looking forward to just working with everybody and, yeah, just going back to it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think we'll now go back to the matters arising that we skipped over in order to enable you people, if you wanted to go on to other duties, so we can get things moving as fast as we can in the audit process.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Graham. Yes, certainly I'll go because there are still other 22 audits that you're ahead of, and I still need to give some attention to. But can I really say I've enjoyed being here? I really have. I think you've always been a very inclusive, making the auditor feel comfortable to be able to contribute along the way to things on the agenda. Hamish did the same thing. And by that, I think council gets the most benefit, because what Clarence can bring to the meeting is what's happening in the sector. Are there changes at the OAG level? Things like that. And so I've certainly enjoyed my time here. Even though 2022 wasn't the best, I nonetheless, I haven't changed my view at all. You're a great council. This is a great audit and risk committee, and I can only, share my thoughts and support for the committee. And so thank you. Janine, on a very personal note, thank you very much for your time. And Graham, on a very personal note, I've known you for an awful long time, back to Deloitte days. Thank you very much for your guidance and inviting us and making us feel comfortable.
Thank you. Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is our standard report in terms of trying to keep track of actions arising from previous meetings, and ensuring that those have all been addressed. So I think everything has largely been closed out, with a number of those items being reflected into today's agenda, which may be the more appropriate place to pick up those conversations. I know from earlier discussions with both Chair Graham and Paul, some conversation around those the health and safety risks and risk appetite, and the separation that we've done around the critical and common risks. We can have more conversation in there. And yes, as I say, I think the other matters are covered within the agenda. Close those out.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee, or we have a mover and seconder to receive the report? Thank you. All in favour say aye. Contrary, carried. Thank you. We now move on to item 7, risk management activity update.
Me. Again, still me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think in terms of the front part of the report, which is a little bit of that sort of situational assessment, Tracy covered a lot of that off in her observations. Probably the other area just to note that is within here is the focus that has been given to enrolment of staff in that civil defence training, particularly at a foundational level. So 65 staff so far this year having participated in that, which is all about building our capacity and capability around our response activities. So that's a really pleasing signal. We've noted there in terms of the staff recruitment and retention. But overall, the trends are actually, for us as an organisation versus our peers, actually looking really positive. I think this does continue to be a real challenge for us, though. The market updates with migration, some parts of the job market are easing with that injection of new capacity into them. But with the nature of the professional skills that we actually require in our organisation to do what we do, those trends are not really addressing those key skill shortages. And then just the overall increasing trends in labour market costs as well that we're needing to address. Inflation continues to be an issue. I think what we see is forecasts of that headline CPI easing through to the end of next year, some saying a little bit earlier than that. But I think that is a measure of CPI rather than the core inflationary pressures that we face as an organisation. And I think those matters are probably a little bit more ingrained and a bit harder to shift. Certainly things like recovery activities in Hawke's Bay, which will be consuming capacity both from a staff perspective and from a contractor perspective, will, in my view, continue to hold those rates at a higher level than may have been the case without such matters happening. In terms of the substantive report, so there's a couple of elements to it. We've got our regular strategic risk update in terms of some of the deep dives. Those deep dives are against our current strategic risks and strategic risk statements. I think the substantial conversation maybe for the committee, though, is around the work that has been done, both with elected members and with the executive team as well, in the restatement of our strategic risks, and an opportunity to get feedback on those. I know we've got David online. Worth noting that pending this committee's approval of those, that they would be recommended to full council for adoption. I have been advised through the last couple of days of some minor wording changes to a couple of those, so particularly in terms of climate change, just removal of an emerging regulatory standards, and in terms of the giving effect to te tiriti, just noting as well as the treaty, there are also associated other legislative obligations that are key in that space. But Mr. Chair, we've got David online.
Yes.
Not sure whether you want to just step through these
I think we should.
strategic risks as restated, and take feedback or questions in relation to those so that we're in a position to get those finalised with the council.
So Janine, did you want me to walk that through? Or we just take comments?
Yeah.
No, walk us through it, David.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so look, just as a few opening remarks on the statement. Look, I think it's been a really good process to have these discussions, and this is all about trying to get consensus and clarity around where council needs to take risk and where it does, where it shouldn't. So it's important that as councillors that you are comfortable with those positions. They will generally be the way that guide management and staff into positions, and some of these are competing interests. So risks have tensions between them, as we talked about in one of those sessions. So I do expect that there may be changes. I do expect that these will probably be enhanced over time, but it would be good to get your thoughts and comments. So if we go to the, so I'm on page 50, I'll move through from page 49 in terms of the interpretation. Just to, I guess, highlight the content on each risk page, which hopefully you've read through. What is the risk that we're talking about? Who is the owner? And I think that's been a good step forward to be quite clear who in the management team has prime responsibility for managing that risk. Obviously, there'll be interactivity and staff involved, but I think having someone on the management team responsible is quite key. Then we have the overview of the risk area, and in some cases that has been tweaked or changed. The risk appetite statement, which is the overarching position, and then we break that open a little bit more and try to give some contrast as to where we will and where we won't take risk. So the first risk is emergency response. Oh, sorry, I should have also mentioned on the right, the diagrams describe or summarize the risk appetite setting as set out in the document against the current risk level. That should tie through to your other risk reporting. And it also talks about the connections to other risks. So we've used our interconnectivity model to say, well, actually, when we're thinking about emergency response, we need to be thinking about people. We need to be thinking about financial sustainability or impacts of climate change or impacts on stakeholders. So it's trying to think about, well, how might that impact risk appetite? So the first risk was around emergency response, and obviously post Gabrielle, most councils that we're working with have looked to reset some of their response levels to emergencies, certainly expectations of your communities to step in. And so the overarching risk appetite statement is that risk appetite is low. We effectively are going to prioritise wellbeing of our communities and responding to those events when they occur. Summarising some of the key points, where we will take risk, obviously acknowledges the fact that these are not fully controllable events. They are inherently uncertain and difficult to manage, but there is a best efforts type theme that goes through it. And effectively making sure that we are complying with the Council's emergency response framework, making sure that we've got the right level of investment and that it's appropriately staffed and staff have the right capability, and making sure that we do maintain that capability going forward to respond in times of crises. So perhaps I'll just pause. If there's any questions or comments?
Carry on.
Okay. Risk 2, in terms of legislative compliance, this encompasses also, and this was a change to the risk of change to legislative compliance rather than just complying with what currently exists. As you would expect, there are expectations of council to make sure that it is a good citizen and does generally comply, but the risk appetite statement acknowledges that, again, there are challenges around that, particularly around future regulation, and that does create risk for council. Saying that, in terms of where we will take less risk, effectively where there is legislative requirements in place, council has a low appetite. You expect processes and frameworks to make sure that you are complying, and that you won't trade off compliance for performance. I think that is a key trade-off point that's important to acknowledge. Making sure that we are putting focus on those obligations that will support the future direction of council. All right, I'll keep going from there. Relationships, the importance of relationships and the multitude of communities and stakeholders that council needs to manage. The appetite effectively focuses on the importance of those relationships. It acknowledges the medium risk appetite, which is there's a lot of factors at play that make it difficult to manage and mitigate those risks that could flow and have impacts on our stakeholders, and even the different stakeholders make it difficult to control that down to low levels. Where we'll take risk is around trying to get the best outcome for all parties, which still means that there is that trade-off potentially for different stakeholders. And effectively, where we will take risk is around making sure that we have the right cultural and technical capability around stakeholder management, and making sure that we're keeping pace with the changing regulatory environment and the extent to which that might create risk for stakeholders. We're wanting to manage that carefully and trying to navigate through stakeholder relationships. Okay, I'll take silence as
carry on.
endorsement.
Just keep going, David.
If I'm going too slow, please let me know, Graham, and I can speed up. People, capability and culture. I think there were some great opening remarks from the acting chief executive around the importance of people. It is one of the most central risks. It's connected to everything. Particularly the risk appetite statement is that we have a low risk appetite for having an organisation that doesn't attract, retain and support people. There is a risk in terms of the ability to, obviously the external environment is difficult to control, and there's a lot of competition. But effectively, it is representing the appetite to invest, significantly invest in making sure we've got the right capability and people to support council's strategy and direction. Health and safety, typically an area, obviously, because of its sensitivity, that we wouldn't expect council to be taking risk, and that's reflected within the statement. Obviously, a low risk appetite, and really, some councils have articulated areas they are willing to take risk around health and safety, and that might be in areas of using volunteers, or perhaps stepping into social procurement where those third parties may not have the maturity of health and safety that some of the bigger contractors might have. But here we're really setting quite a strong message that we will not trade off health and safety for other priorities. We will manage it as far as practically possible.
Mr. Chair, can I just ask a question on health and safety? Kia ora, David, Pamela Story here. We were having a conversation with another TA just the other day around health and safety with regards to politicians. I just wanted to check in on this. Obviously, we want to make sure all of our staff members and contractors return home from work safely every day. But just wondering if there's an assessment or a view of whether or not we perceive there to be an increased risk to politicians. It's something other TAs have raised.
I agree. I think council would need to make that assessment, but I think it is a very good observation, given a general perception across the sector that democracy is fraying slightly. There is more heat on politicians, so and perhaps a bit more quite binary reactions to politicians, as we saw with Jacinda Ardern, who had massive support and then massive detractors. So I think it would depend on the community that you're in, but I think that is a very good risk to raise and to be considered from a health and safety perspective, and incorporated into the health and safety framework if deemed critical or deemed appropriate. And I dare say it would be.
Thanks, David.
David, with health and safety, given that we have a statutory obligation to take all practical steps to keep people safe, I was surprised that you'd reached the current risk level as being high. It doesn't sit well with me, what I know of, excuse me, the health and safety systems at Waikato region, that is the case.
Yes, and that's the rub.
Because normally, if they were high, wouldn't you be having to stop certain activities to reduce that current risk down much closer to the risk appetite?
Yes, and that's what this is trying to provoke in terms of setting that level. That level is unchanged, Graham, and the residual risk was assessed by the risk owner. So that can be where we have perceptions of the environment, and I think it is important to compare it to the risk appetite and ask the question, can we practically reduce that delta between the two levels? The risk mitigation strategy should aim to do that. From a governance point of view, the questions that you should be asking is, how soon will that happen? Are we comfortable we're making enough investment into health and safety? Do we have the right processes, systems and capability to bring that risk down to appetite? And that should be and I have seen it earlier on in your papers, that is the emphasis of highlighting that gap and then working through what are the key programs to bring that risk down lower.
Do we have a maths problem here, David? I'm not sure which camera to look at. That if you've got a likelihood of low and a consequence of extreme, someone could die perhaps, which is an extreme outcome, then you can never get below medium. It's mathematically impossible. And we can do as much as we think we need to prevent the risk, because the likelihood is rare or extremely unlikely. But because you do this little trick when you make these matrices up, we always end up with a medium again because of the outcome. And so we may not be actually wrong at all.
Yeah, Paul, it's a good question. Comes up very often. I always try and keep things very simple. Look, I think you can always say there is a very low likelihood of a death. There's always a worst case scenario, but my preference is to say, given the strength of Waikato Regional Council's or the need for the strength in Waikato Regional Council's risk management frameworks and controls and mitigations, we would generally expect to be able to produce a result that has a low likelihood of a lesser injury rather than the low likelihood of a death. So that means you can actually get that risk down to lower levels if we feel that that's appropriate. But I think the challenge is right to make. But I do feel we always opt for that worst case scenario of a low likelihood of a death, which, as you say, it's difficult to get down below that sort of orange, yellow level into that blue zone.
Yeah, so we've done that. So in the current version of the risk report, there's now 2 health and safety risks. One's the critical risk and one's the common risk. And I think we could have a discussion about scoring under the common risk. But the concept there is, what is the likelihood and the consequence of a minor injury? And I think that one you can get right down, because you can say it's unlikely and the consequence is low. So therefore the answer, which is here medium, it could be a bit lower, I think. But yeah, so the council has tried to address the fact that we're not just talking about deaths, right? We are talking about all these other injuries, and that includes well-being, mental health, and all the stuff we spend a lot of time on. So yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
No, it's good. It's a good comment, Paul. And look, I think most boards and those in governance feel very uncomfortable having a risk appetite that is above low. But it applies to any risk. If there is basically an inequality between how we're measuring residual risk and how we're setting our risk targets, then we have to face into that. How that would work if you were to say, well, actually, we can't get health and safety anytime down below yellow, you just need to explain that. Say, well, all of our intention is around having a safe environment that even goes above and beyond the legislative requirement. But because of the uncontrollability factor, we can't get it down below those levels. To me, it's that clarity to describe why you're willing to tolerate a target that is higher than low. So that's an option that could be perhaps picked up by management to consider.
Right. Keep going.
All right, keep going. Information technology, obviously, to the extent that it supports the strategy, there have been some tweaks to think about this more broadly. Overall, there is a medium risk appetite, noting some of the inherent risks and vulnerability in more broadly, globally, and in New Zealand. I thought it was quite good to acknowledge, where we will take risk, we have a high appetite for embracing more digital opportunities. So we're not going to shy away from the downside risks of information technology, such as, generative AI, because of the opportunity of embracing those technologies. So we'll try and manage both as we move forward. And we're also going to make sure that we can uplift our cyber strategy. Where we have, we'll take less risk is around, obviously, people doing things that open up the organisation to incidents, and making sure that we've got good levels of investment in this area. But as I say, I quite like the balance, rather than just saying it's all downside. I think there was good balance with upside and downside risk in that particular risk. Financial sustainability, and that is again ensuring that we have the right level of liquidity and sustainability to support the strategy moving forward. The appetite set at medium. Obviously, there is that balance between delivering on the needs of the community but also balance that up against aspects such as affordability for ratepayers. There are areas of low appetite in terms of not being able to support critical infrastructure and also support communities in times of crises, which might have a financial impact on sustainability. So a couple of those key points coming through there. Moving forward into fraud, obviously an area that affects council's trust with the community. We would expect a fairly low appetite for that, and that's what has been set. Obviously, a lot of areas of not taking risk, which is around zero tolerance for it, not having the right processes in place to mitigate against fraud. But there was some balance there to say, look, we're not going to not explore new technologies that may help us to further mitigate fraud-related risk. So I thought that was a good balance. Moving forward from there into quite a complex area, climate change, obviously an area of significant focus. Medium risk appetite given the uncertainty going forward. In terms of where we will take risk, obviously noting the impacts on key strategic priorities and the need to deliver on those. And that may have a trade-off impact around climate change. Low risk appetite in terms of failing on its climate change strategic objectives because it has failed to engage with communities, including iwi, mana whenua and central government. And certainly having a low appetite towards failing to manage climate-related risks and fail to safeguard our communities as we move forward. And low appetite for being non-compliant with any climate change-related standards.
Thank you, David. Questions?
Sorry, Graham, there was one more and quite an important one, I think, which is a risk 10. And this is an area that I think has had significant discussion across all the territorial authorities that we've worked with over the last 2 or 3 months. And this is giving effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so, you know, there are some strong statements in there about council being committed to delivering on its obligations and partnering, and certainly low risk appetite around failing to uphold tikanga and cultural competency when engaging with the iwi mana whenua, and certainly low appetite for not adhering to legislative and statutory obligations as set out by Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Thank you, David. Any questions? Jennifer?
Hi there, David. My question, I am of the understanding that in September of this year, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is supposed to land. And when I look at the climate, it's closely related to the climate change one, and we're already mentioning TCFD there. Is there anything you can say to us about the trajectory of where regional council is looking? Has that come up, or that you're advising on about whether that would fit in with that in the next review for that topic, or whether that would be a future topic to explore?
I think it's a great point to raise. I think councils are still very firmly in the climate change, still working through that, but it will be a fast follower. I think it's a good comment to be picked up. There's no reason we can't integrate that into risk appetite thinking now, so it kind of sets the path moving forward. So I would actually say that why don't we pick that up as a action?
Appreciate that. Thank you. I've got some other ones as well, but
just through the chair, I'd note in terms of like the TCFD framework is one in terms of doing the risk deep dives, that we are trying to recast all of those as we come across them into those four pillars, so that because it's just a really useful model, and so using that through the deep dive process to look at those different elements and think of what our controls are in that space.
and fingers crossed, maybe the TNFD will be quite similar in framework to the TCFD, and it's not too difficult. Great, thank you.
Yeah, still many organisations getting their heads around TCFD.
Yeah, early
CS1.
Just want to be on the forefront of thinking about it. Thanks.
You have some more questions?
Yeah, I did have another one. So this one is about the emergency response one earlier on. Just mindful of the, and perhaps something that Pamela, you might like to comment on, the biosecurity issues that we're seeing. And I just thought in that table, one of the risk drivers that I thought wasn't really in there, and maybe it's not overly politically correct, but about the adequacy of the response from MPI and how we relate to that, because I'm mindful that whether it's, we can make sure that we have resourcing to respond to biosecurity risk, but our relationship with MPI is very important, and the perception of how, say, the golden clam is managed is out there. We will be judged on it as much as MPI in the perception sense. So just wondering whether there's anything that, based on recent events, is missing, or maybe it's also something Greg might like to comment on as the risk owner, that hasn't been captured in there that we should put in there on biosecurity.
Did you want to comment? I can.
That's
I
all
mean,
right.
I can say, I think it's a.
No, the
it's a-
detailed
it's a-
table, so
Yeah, yeah.
just a
So
call out.
I think it's a really good point. I think it is important though to, golden, I guess the golden clam is an example.
Yes.
It's speaking to, council's responsibilities and the way that we work with others.
Yeah, it's about
and
us.
who's actually leading.
Yeah.
And I think we can just, Greg, I'm not sure that it needs anything more than that, other
Yeah.
than just to reflect that tone
Yeah.
through that in an emergency response, we're likely to be one of.
It's that coordination, isn't it?
Yeah.
So roles and
mindful we're pushing.
responsibilities. Yeah.
And so if we are pushing, let's mention that we are pushing. Doesn't hurt. It's an activity we do to do the best we can as one of the partners. That's all. Just in case you know anything else, Pamela. Topic.
Oh, no, I think you raise a really interesting point, because I looked at this in terms of CDM, right? A civil defense type of emergency.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't classify the golden clam as that. But you raise an interesting point. If we looked at, say, if all of a sudden we had foot and mouth, that requires a massive immediate response, which I would assume could utilize some of the systems of our CDM response to ensure effectiveness. So you raise a really interesting point of, do we look at our emergency response through a broader lens of the types of emergencies we might need to respond to? So well mentioned.
Yeah. I don't think it comes through clearly when it says emergency response that it includes biosecurity as well.
I think this is around our, as an organisation, our capability to respond
Yeah.
to that type of unforeseen event, which is where things like,
That's right.
you know, the emergency response framework, we should be able to run a whole bunch of things through there and go, what do we need to do? But I think it is silent probably on that matter in terms of we are quite often acting with others, and we will not always be the one in charge. Or we shouldn't always be the one in charge. So
Yeah.
that coordination, roles and responsibilities, I think, really good.
I've
call
seen
out.
through the Karakia Golf Forum really strong pressure on MPI for Kalaupapa seaweed as well. And it's something that we do is push really hard. So I thought it's worth mentioning, I think, as a control.
Any further questions from the committee?
Two tiny ones I had was, I saw in that one, they talk about ROSCs and GMO, GEMO. If we could just spell things out. I don't know what those two things are. That'd be
Regional
awesome.
On-Scene Commander.
Thank you. And
Group Emergency Management Office.
And just something I didn't pick up previously, but we have in that table 5 on page 15, when we say which months or which committee meetings we review which ones, I just noted that in March we have 4, and then all the others we have 2.
So.
There's
yes,
steps to
I've-
that, I assume, that we don't have to have 3 in the
No,
summer. point?
so I have recast that moving forward, so to smooth that out
Thanks.
a little bit.
I thought-
So that there's we're doing everything gets a review once a year.
Totally. And not too much
Not-
all at once.
Not some getting
Yeah.
loved twice.
Thanks.
I've got questions on the earlier schedules. Is it appropriate to raise those
Absolute-
now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so and this is on board books 29, I think, and it's a health and safety one, so Strato 5 health and safety. And me a nitpicker, but I wonder whether the management would like to look at the definition of the risk. So the last words of the paragraph that defines the risk is that results that they are not protected from risks arising from work, which is kind of not the way the health and safety systems work. It's not all about protecting people. So what we do is we either don't do things, or we isolate people, or if we can't isolate people, we provide training and PPE. So there's a whole range of different things. So to me, it's that komahi or workers may be harmed. It's not people not protected, it's people may be harmed. That's right, and I think you need to get quite explicit about the risk. I know it's a picky point, but that's my picky point to take away and think about. I don't need an answer, by the way. Listen, the things I'm smoking dope. You should tell me. Page 35, we're talking about the strategic risk deep dive into emergency response. Now, it seems to me there's been a lot of focus on capability, and if we look at some of the actions, it's all about getting enough people trained and that's good. So that's fine. I understand where we've come from. But again, sort of using the same blunt language, which I sometimes like to use, is there is a risk that Waikato Regional Council is unable to respond. So as unable, it's sort of failed to respond efficiently, or fails to respond effectively. So it's not focused on our ability, it's that we actually don't get it right on the day. And I'm kind of highly sensitized about this because I'm also involved in Auckland Council. And as you know, we've not done so well. Moving on to the risk drivers. In the compliance section, we talk about one of the drivers being lack of coordination between local authorities within the region in response to major events. I don't actually talk about that as a driver of risk in the actual major events, page 36. And I wonder whether, and one of the issues, which again, a lesson from Auckland, has been lack of coordination. And it's not just with other local authorities, because that's important, but it's often community groups and communities, because it's the community groups and communities that actually get hands and feet on the ground and help things. So lack of coordination with other authorities within the region, other authorities and community groups and organisations or communities. I just want to think about that. And one of the other things that we learned was poor comms and leaders not being visible. So we had no CEO present, we had no mayor present for a while. And if we look at the root cause of that, there's an argument that there was a lack of communication to the mayor. So one of the causes or risk drivers, one of a driver of risk is poor communication internally, so that people who are important, like our chair, don't understand how serious an event is because no one's told them. So a driver of failure is poor communications internally, and I wonder whether you want to put a bullet in for that, maybe. Yeah, and then leadership, but I mean, yeah, I don't know leadership in here, but leadership of the process, again, was an issue for Auckland. It possibly isn't, because I can see, I'm not being critical of what's going on here. There's some amazing work, always has been, in this region, but just some little points.
Thank you. And I think that there's some complexity here too in how our Civil Defense Joint Management Committee is set up. So it's got its chair, which is not me. And so I think that there is some communication issues that can arise out of that, because community will look to either mayors or the chair to speak in those types of events, but that's not my mandate. It sits with the CEDM committee. And so I think that there's some interesting complexities around how we ensure that the messages are interpreted correctly, because it came up during Cyclone Gabriel and during the Auckland floods as well, where we had various parts of the region declaring states of emergency. And then once there was three, there was a regional state of emergency, but parts of the region had no emergency. And so you raised some really valid points around ensuring that through our civil defense management response, we're clear in our communication to our communities as to who they need to look to for that messaging. Raising that.
Any other questions? The resolution in front of us is to receive section A and to recommend to council the approval of the statement of risk appetite. Are you comfortable to do that, or do we need to get those points that have been raised wordsmithed first?
Yeah, or it might just be that with the qualifier noting the discussion or feedback from the committee, so that we do rather than hold the process up, but that we actually take a notes, got it recorded. We have a record of that we can fold in.
Yep.
In terms of how these will actually come back.
Just sorry, Mr. Chair, just in terms of that, because our minutes are not necessarily fulsome on recording what was discussed. Will that come through in the actions arising, or where does this committee get to scan our eyes over and make sure that what we felt needed to be captured was indeed captured?
Yeah.
Good point.
Very happy to include that in the matters arising, so that it's a good track record of what was the discussion, how can you see it actually being reflected back to you. The feedback, maybe.
That need modification then to the fact that feedback is right.
I'm happy to do that. I think just in terms of the recommendation, James, just to strengthen it a little bit from discussion, but the feedback. There was there are changes that are required, and discussion doesn't necessarily convey that there's modifications required.
Okay, do we have a mover and seconder? Thank you, Pamela. Seconder, Paul. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much. And thank you, David. Or are you here for the next one?
I think I will be here. I'll stay on for the internal audit update.
Okay, I think we've been nearly meeting for 2 hours. I think we should probably take a short break and reconvene at, say, 11:05. Thank you.